Chris Morrow and I'm a chicken veterinarian, and over the years I've worked for Aviagen and as a veterinary pathologist as well, and had a lot of experience in the Asian region. In my PhD I investigated the effect of MS infections in Australia, and since that time I've worked on looking at the impact of MS, Mycoplasma synoviae, all around the world. I am the Global Technical Manager of Bioproperties, but I also invented the vaccine MSH. So if we look at the background of Mycoplasma in poultry, I think it's very hard to just concentrate on MG or MS. So in this talk I'll often make comments that have application to both these infections. These infections came to prominence because they cause disease, but we also know since that time that they cause production inefficiencies, especially from the chronic infection that they do, and also that they have caused the poultry industries to be very dependent on antibiotics until we found a solution for Mycoplasma. So if we quantify the cost of these infections, looking at Mycoplasma gallisepticum, in layers, a lot of the studies done in the 1980s looked at infected flocks versus uninfected flocks, and they saw that the losses were something like 10 to 20 eggs per hen per year. If a flock wasn't infected and became infected during lay, these could have production drops, something like 30% drop in production over 2 weeks and then coming back up in production after that. There's effects also on hatchability, and this is due to the Mycoplasma causing late embryo deaths, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But if we look at Mycoplasma gallisepticum, if you mix Mycoplasma gallisepticum and an SPF bird together in a laboratory, you can cause primary respiratory disease. And if you add extra, this is a simple disease where the birds get sick with respiratory symptoms. But also if there's other factors involved like air quality or poor co-infections as well, you can go on to cause chronic respiratory disease or CRD. The mortality and poor FCR, conversion of feed into meat, is seen, especially in the progeny in the field, because we have vertical transmission of Mycoplasma gallisepticum. Back in the 1980s, FCR in layers wasn't very important, and so they didn't make any estimates of the effect on the efficiency of turning feed into eggs. Although you can see if you're losing 10 to 20 eggs per hen per year, that it's going to have an effect, but there's maybe even more than that. And also that these effects in layers especially can be subclinical. The birds might show no signs of infection at all, no disease signs, but you have these production losses. Mycoplasma synoviae, on the other hand, is usually considered to be less pathogenic, but there's wide variation in the effects of Mycoplasma synoviae that are very strain dependent, and even some diseases are only seen with certain strains. So an estimate of the average loss from Mycoplasma synoviae infection is 5 to 10 eggs per year per hen, and again, this can be even without the birds having any clinical signs. There are strains of Mycoplasma synoviae that cause egg production drops if the birds become infected during lay, although notably the strains that cause glass top eggs don't seem to affect production very much. Decreases in hatchability have also been attributed to Mycoplasma synoviae, and in some ways Mycoplasma synoviae is the great pretender. Anything that Mycoplasma gallisepticum can do, Mycoplasma synovium has also been seen to cause. In trying to evaluate the impact of Mycoplasma synovium, it's very important to look through the total production integration. We had a strain in the UK that came with hybrid birds that caused nothing in parent stock, caused nothing in the broiler generation, but in the abattoir, in the slaughterhouse, we saw increased condemnations. And this highlights the need to look at the total effect in the production system. If you mix Mycoplasma synovium and SPF chickens, you'll often see nothing. But this is, we're used to seeing this nowadays in our production systems. Same thing happens with H9 avian influenza. In the laboratory appears to be nearly inconsequential, mixed with SPF birds. TRT, avian metapneumovirus, very similar in the laboratory, very hard to produce disease by itself. But if we put other things in, like Mycoplasma synovium with respiratory viruses or even respiratory vaccines, we start to see chronic respiratory disease and also this effect is big. E. coli peritonitis at the beginning of lay and layers is also thought to be triggered by Mycoplasma synovium. And what we think happens in a lot of places where if you can rear the birds free of Mycoplasma synovium and they only get challenged when you move them to the production site, then the Mycoplasma synovium at this time, the birds haven't seen it before, get a low-grade peritonitis, and then opportunistic infections like E. coli and so on can jump in on top of it. And the hallmark of this is when you analyse the E. colis, they're not clonal. They are just any E. coli that's floating around. The infectious synovitis, considered the classic disease by associated with MS, is only seen with some strains, and when it happens you see it in an area quite a lot, but in other areas without these strains we don't see synovitis. At the moment, one of the big areas that is having infectious synovitis is yellow chicken production in southern China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and also it's tending to spread out of just that niche into other poultry flocks in China now. Glass top eggs we're going to talk a little bit about, but this emerged in the year 2000 as a totally new syndrome, and we'll talk about that. And I'm going to show you from our trials the evidence that we have that the FCR, the efficiency of turning feed into eggs, is also affected by Mycoplasma synovium. Here's the model we have for chronic respiratory disease, and I think it's also relevant to peritonitis. First, you have some sort of respiratory insult. This could be a virus or a vaccine even, especially Lesotho, or it could be environmental conditions, air quality, ammonia, dust, and so on. This allows the superinfection with Mycoplasma gallisepticum or even Mycoplasma synovium, and finally we see death in these animals when opportunistic organisms get on top of the Mycoplasma superinfection. So here's a Mycoplasma synovium plus infectious bronchitis. Without infectious bronchitis we saw very little, and without Mycoplasma synovium we didn't see the air sacculitis. And at a post-mortem in the field you cannot tell whether this is MS or MG. You've got to do further laboratory testing in these situations. Here we can see air sacculitis in the pipped embryo, and what happens is that the pip at day 18, or the embryo at day 18, does internal pipping. It puts its head into the air cell and starts to breathe. The oxygen comes up, it gets extra strength, and it can break out of the eggshell. But where we have this disease already in the respiratory tract, and the respiratory tract is starting to be used at day 18, the oxygen doesn't get high enough, and the chicks cannot break out of the shell. So this is a technique that is sometimes used to monitor how well we're controlling the mycoplasma. Again, we can't tell whether it's MS or MG unless we do further laboratory testing. For instance, PCR on the purulent material there, collecting on the air sac. And most hatcheries have a cutoff of something like 20 to 25% of pips. If it goes over that with air saculitis, then the mycoplasma seems to be out of control. Here's the glass top eggs, and you can see here that we have these breaks in the shell, and also the shell becomes translucent at the top of the apex. The air cell is down the other way. And one of the very unique things about this is that it is responsive to antibiotics, and Mycoplasma synovium can be isolated from the oviduct. Normally, MS can only be isolated from the ovary, not the oviduct. It may be strain associated, and also infectious bronchitis can have a big effect on the incidence. It's used in the experimental model. It started in about the year 2000 in the Netherlands and Germany, and then it started to spread around the world. We saw up to 4% of eggs affected, sometimes even as high as 10% affected. And again, when we were looking at this in the beginning, we only saw one end of the egg being affected and the response to antibiotics, and it gave us a lot of confidence in the diagnosis. But the manifestations we're seeing in Asia now are not quite as clear as this. This is typical of a new disease in a new host, or a novel host, and so on. And I think that over time it will become harder and harder to recognise. This is what it looks like in brown eggs there. But note, I've never seen it in broiler breeders. Some people have told me they have. I'm not so sure. Again, only one end, and so on. In broiler breeders, I've never seen glass top eggs. When they first start to appear, this is me in Japan here, but they often become more evident, the glass top eggs, over 24 hours. This tray of eggs was at a grading station in Japan, and the glass top eggs had already been removed the day before on the farm, and here we can see that more have developed overnight. So in trying to control mycoplasma infections, we've used biosecurity. It's best to have the same strategy for MG and MS in control. So people who tell me that, oh, we control MG by vaccination and MS by antibiotics, this is a silly idea. You're really controlling both by antibiotics. And also, not all live vaccines are the same, and I'm going to point out some differences. So, like I said, one of the first academic ways to control mycoplasma, and certainly it's been very effective at the elite level in breeding programs, is mycoplasma freedom. It hasn't been that effective in yellow chicken breeding programs because they are not set up the same way or have the same size as Western poultry breeding programs. Antibiotics is the only thing you can do once birds become infected there. But this is incompatible with freedom, especially antibiotics will also tend to suppress the serological response and make it difficult to detect whether you are free or not. Killed vaccines have been tried, and they certainly help in certain situations, but they have problems in total control of mycoplasma. And live vaccines, I think, are probably the state of the art now for production systems close to the commercial production. We shouldn't just think that we can combine these control measures. Here's the only data I've ever seen on live and dead control together. And what they did here in University of Georgia, they were bringing these hens into lay about 20 weeks in there, and they challenged them. They had different groups they'd treated, and they challenged them with R strain in the laboratory. And in the control group, they completely had an egg drop very similar or maybe more dramatic than we see in the field because it's totally synchronized. And with F strain vaccination, they got very good protection up here. Killed vaccines tended to give only a little bit of protection here, and most interestingly, the live and dead vaccines combined were only as good as the killed vaccine, and not as good as the live vaccine by itself. This suggests to me that killed vaccines can get in the way of the protection offered by live vaccines. If we look at where people have traditionally used antibiotics regularly in chickens, initially it was growth promoting, was done nearly universally before the year 2000, and then it's been phased out. Ionophores are an antibiotic, but I think it's a marketing problem more than a problem similar to the use of the other antibiotics, and we use them mainly for protection against coccidiosis. Using antibiotics in the hatchery, in ovo, or in the first week, really this is laziness in applying. The use of antibiotics every 4 to 8 weeks during lay, I think, is particularly aimed at mycoplasma. And here, this is where live mycoplasma vaccines or freedom can have a massive impact and allow us to phase these out. Also, antibiotic stays on day 18 to 22 in broilers, and maybe even in replacement stock, so-called to prevent so-called post-vaccinal reaction, can also be phased out if you can keep the mycoplasma out of the day-old chick. And here, that's the solution there. So if you do get control of mycoplasma and don't have to do antibiotics every 4 to 8 weeks, you can also, in the progeny of these flocks, not use antibiotics for post-vaccinal reaction. The onset of lay, we talked about the E. coli, peritonitis and so on. If you control mycoplasmas, I don't think you're going to have this is a problem anymore. Free-range chickens have some other problems which we won't talk about today. So control of mycoplasma would allow you to not use antibiotics everywhere where there's the yellow there. If we look at how much antibiotic is used in these antibiotic programs, we can see at 20 megs per keg for a week, a month, we're looking annually in 1 million birds of something like 3.65 tonnes of antibiotic. This is an enormous amount of antibiotic. In broiler breeders, this is looking at an integration that has 400,000 parent stock, and here we can see breeders that have giving every 4 weeks during lay at 20 megs per keg, and then also having to give in broilers to stop post-vaccinal reactions, because mycoplasmas will decrease the impact in the breeders, but they won't stop reliably stop vertical transmission completely. They'll decrease it. We can see here that an integration of 400,000 parent stock would commonly use about 6.7 tonnes of antibiotic per year. I've been interested in this, and I've been looking around, especially where we were using antibiotics to flush birds before vaccination, and not having much success in Vietnam, especially in coloured chickens. What we found there was that we're getting multiple resistance appearing in the antibiotics. Resistance to, in this case, we've got something like 7 or 8 different groups there having resistance to in the J2 Mycoplasma gallisepticum, and leaving very few antibiotics left. Personally, I think my reaction to this is, if we've only got 3 antibiotics left there, then and it's already got resistance to so many antibiotics, that we need to be investigating other ways of controlling mycoplasma immediately before resistance flares up to these other antibiotics there. And in fact, I made a Mycoplasma gallisepticum isolate from Taiwan, and it had very similar resistance there. The red ones are mycoplasma, resistant strain. And in fact, in this one, we're even seeing tylosin. Yes, we've only got, again, 3 antibiotics left. So I don't think we can just keep relying on antibiotics in poultry production. So the history of avian mycoplasma vaccination first was an idea that you use controlled exposure. If you, in the 1960s, if you got birds infected before they started to lay, then you would not get egg production drops in lay. You'd have predictable production. Bactrians were introduced in the 1970s and have provided some protection against symptoms, especially, but they didn't control infections. They might reduce vertical transmission, but you still had problems. Then an idea to use mild strains was tried, and this led to the development of F strain, K strain, and 685, and these had problems where, in fact, the Taiwanese mycoplasmologist Michael Lee pointed out that the stronger the vaccine, the more residual virulence it had in it. We developed attenuated strains in the 1980s, and I consider this the 3rd generation of mycoplasma vaccines. And here we have TS11, and also a son of TS11, which is coming along, 304, and MSH. There are some GMOs around, but these don't seem to be all that effective, and they've been here for a long time, and they are not getting used very much, only in certain situations. I don't think they provide any protection. They're a good vaccine in the absence of challenge. It's also registered in a lot of countries around the world and has a lot of use. Japan was one of the first countries outside Australia to use it, and also Mexico. It's been used in China since 2017. And the way that we've developed to do these things is to make sure there's no mycoplasma antibiotics in the birds at the time of vaccination. Also, you shouldn't use Lesota or stronger NDV vaccines within 14 days of live mycoplasma vaccination, because sometimes you'll get conjunctivitis like this, and you've got to keep them apart. And the way to give the vaccine is by eye drop, together with the birds need to be at least 21 days old and then they probably need to be given the vaccine at least 5 weeks before they're going to get the challenge. After you've used the vaccine, you don't use prophylactic antimycoplasmal active antibiotics in the flock, especially in the first 5 weeks after vaccination, and you only treat flocks that are clinically sick. And in fact, of interest is if a flock is suffering from, a vaccinated flock is suffering from Newcastle or low path AI, maybe you shouldn't treat them at all, or even IB. Similar to the way when we go to the doctor now, they tell us you have a viral respiratory disease and we're not going to give you antibiotics. Yes. And also, recently we've seen that in the Netherlands, they've had a lot of success by using tilvalicin for 5 days at 25 mg per keg in the water, and then stopping and then vaccinating 48 hours later. Here's a bird being vaccinated. It's important that the full-size drop is formed and then drops into the eye, and then when they blink, it goes down the lacrimal duct and into the respiratory system, and here now you can release the bird. Before that, don't release the bird until it blinks. Here's a summary of trials that we've done in around the world, starting in Australia in 1996, and where it says previous strategies and comments. This is often why we were called in to work in this with the trial. And in all the cases where there was a disease manifestation like glass top eggs or lack of control by an antibiotic, we were able to get control. And as well as this, we started to see advantages in number of eggs out per hen house, or number of saleable chicks, if you look at the Indonesia one there. And we also noticed when we measured FCR that we had improvements, and nominally, let's say in layers it's 4% in the birds that are vaccinated over the unvaccinated birds with the field mycoplasma infection. Well, the cost of production of eggs, 75% of the cost of production of eggs is feed. So if you've got 4% better FCR, that means you've got a 3% reduction in the cost of production. And this is worth the most money. This is where the money. And we have other trials there like Colombia, where we saw a ability to remove 13 antibiotic treatments of the flocks in lay and get benefits as well in the total number. The control of glass top eggs, this was really dramatic in Japan, where eggs have to be perfect, and other markets it's not such a big loss if the egg is still solid, but here you're losing money also on total number of eggs and on FCR. So this trial in Japan only went to 57 weeks because Japanese molt flocks, when they hit 70% production, and so some of the control flocks were molted at 57 weeks, so we couldn't analyse the data after that. But even then, they'd already got 12 extra eggs per hen day out of the increased number of normal eggs and an increase in egg mass, leading to those FCR benefits there. I've looked at vaccinated flocks, and we did this by doing PCRs on these flocks, and with Mycoplasma synovium, MSH, when we vaccinated flocks at 7 weeks of age, by 11 weeks of age, we were able to see that 100% of birds were infected with the vaccine, and it stayed this way until the end of production. When we looked at TS11, it's not so clear. And so what we see is that after 2 weeks, maybe we've got 60% or 50% of the birds positive by PCR, and these are individual PCRs, not pooled samples. And then the TS11 becomes difficult to find. And later on, we can see by 31 weeks that we've got 100% of birds infected with the TS11. There's no field strains of MG or MS in these birds. On all the positive PCRs, we did DIVA PCRs and found no field strains. We can also see here that there's a delay in serological conversion, and I don't think this would be the same in Taiwan because in Australia we have very good air quality, very little respiratory virus challenge in our birds, and I think both of these things could increase serological response. But you can see here that these flocks did not seroconvert until this one here for MG until 31 weeks, and this one here till 35 weeks here. And we know that serology is not associated with protection, so we're not worried about it. But some people worry that this seroconversion, late seroconversion, is actually a field challenge. The DIVA PCRs show that it isn't, and we've done this in many flocks. If they're healthy, no respiratory disease, producing well, then this is very normal behaviour in these TS11 vaccinated flocks. And indeed, we now understand that we get very good control over disease very early on, but field strains might continue to appear on a site for up to 4 cycles after vaccination, and this has recently been published in the Netherlands. And here they're showing that as the number of cycles keeps going on a farm where they use the vaccine, that the number of mycoplasma positive flocks keeps decreasing. But for me, this AMR is the deciding argument, because we have humans that could end up with an infection from poultry, and antibiotics will not save them. So vaccination with live mycoplasma vaccines can be cost effective and a sustainable solution for the continuing problem that mycoplasma has happened in breeders, broilers and layers. Share.